Inside a cocoa buying shed, through rough wooden walls and dusty air with burlap cocoa sacks stacked around a middle-aged African aunt, snatches a harvest ledger from a frightened African girl, standing barefoot in the red dust. A young African woman, alone in a dim village room, opening an old wooden box and discovering her dead father's carved seal and hidden land papers. Her aunt snatched the harvest ledger from her hands in front of the cocoa buyers and called her a curse on her dead father's land. More than 30 men heard it. Some lowered their eyes. Some pretended to study the sacks on the ground. One or two even shook their heads, as if the shame belonged to the girl and not to the woman shouting at her. "You want to count now?" her aunt said, loud enough for the entire buying shed to hear. "After 7 years of eating from my pot, you suddenly think you are wise enough to question me." The girl did not answer. She stood barefoot in the red dust, with cocoa stains on her wrapper and silence in her mouth, while the woman who had raised her waved a ledger she had never once been allowed to read. But the buyers did not know what mattered most. They did not know that the farm being discussed in that crowded shed had never belonged to the woman holding the book. It belonged to the girl standing in front of her. And the girl herself would not fully understand that truth until 9 days later, when a wooden box was opened, an old seal was laid in her palm, and a lie that had lasted 7 harvest seasons finally lost the place it had been hiding. Her name was Amara. She was 20 years old. She knew the age of every cocoa tree on her father's land by the shape of its bark and the bend of its roots after rain. She could tell which pods would ripen early and which ones needed another week of sun. She could split a diseased pod from a healthy one with one glance. She could dry beans evenly, tie sacks tight, and carry more weight on her head than boys who laughed too quickly ever imagined. But there was one thing Amara had never been taught to do. She had never been taught to read the numbers written beside her own labor. And that had made all the difference. Amara's father had died when she was 12. Before that, the farm had been small but respected. Not rich, not grand, but steady. The kind of land a careful man could build a future from if rain came when it should and sickness stayed far from the trees. Her father had been such a man. He had spoken gently, worked hard, and believed in keeping records even when others laughed at him for it. He wrapped documents in cloth. He marked sacks properly. He stored receipts in tins. He used to say that land forgot nothing, but people did. When he died of a fever that took him in 5 days, the farm did not die with him. It passed, as far as Amara understood, into the hands of her father's older sister, Aunt Nali, until Amara was old enough to marry. That was how it had been explained to her. Not with kindness. Not with cruelty either. Just with the flat certainty adults use when they do not expect children to ask questions. "You are young," Aunt Nali had said then. "I will manage the land. You will work. That is how this house will survive." At 12, Amara believed her. At 13, she worked from dawn to dusk. At 14, she stopped expecting praise. At 15, she learned which kind of silence brought the least trouble. And by 16, she had become the sort of girl villagers liked from a distance. Hardworking, respectful, useful. That word follows some girls for years without anyone noticing the insult inside it. Useful. Aunt Nali was not the kind of woman strangers called wicked. That is important to say plainly. In public, she was disciplined, church-going, well-spoken, and quick to mention sacrifice. She wore clean wrappers. She knew how to greet elders. She could cry on command when speaking of her dead brother and the burden he had left behind. People admired such women. They rarely asked what the burden looked like from inside the house. Inside that house, Amara woke first, slept last, and worked a farm people still casually referred to as her father's place, while allowing someone else to profit from it. At the end of each market week, Aunt Nolly handled every sale. She spoke to the buyers, she weighed the sacks, she collected the cash. Then she returned home and announced the result. The rains spoiled half the yield. 3 sacks were underweight. The buyer lowered the rate. The farm brought less this week. Always less. Always disappointing. Always accompanied by a sigh designed to make Amara feel guilty for even existing inside so much difficulty. Amara never argued. Not because she was stupid, because she had no tool with which to challenge a number once spoken aloud by someone everyone else called responsible. That is how certain lies survive. Not through force, through one person knowing and another person having no way to check. The village of Awere sold its cocoa through a long tin-roofed buying shed at the road's edge. The place smelled of dust, fermentation, sweat, rope fiber, and rain-soaked burlap. Men came with bicycles and ledgers. Women came with produce and gossip. Children ran between the poles unless chased away. Amara knew every sound there. The thud of sacks hitting the scale, the scratch of pen on carbon paper, the low arguments over moisture and weight, the quick laugh of people who knew exactly how much power money gave them over those who produced it. For years, Amara carried sacks to that shed and watched Aunt Nolly step in front of her at the crucial moment. "This one is family land," her aunt would say. "I will handle the account." And because she was older, louder, and held the papers, no one objected. Then, early in the long dry season, a new man began appearing at the shed. He was not a buyer. That much Amara knew immediately. Buyers spoke like men who needed goods and believed money made them patient. This man spoke like someone measuring things that had not yet been named aloud. His name, she said later, entered her life quietly enough that she nearly missed it. Malik. He said he worked with the new district cooperative office, traveling village to village, helping farmers prepare for a regional registration system that would soon require every producing farm to be matched properly to its owner, acreage, and output records. This did not interest Amara at first. Big words came to villages all the time. Registration, reform, verification, extension. They arrived in fine shirts, made dust, and left. But Malik kept returning. The first time, he asked simple questions. How many acres? How old were the trees? How many sacks did the upper grove usually yield compared to the lowland rows after strong rain? Aunt Nolly answered most of them. Amara answered one without meaning to. The western strip yields less after too much shade. Malik turned to her at once. You work the western strip? I work all of it, she said. Aunt Nolly cut in sharply. She means she helps. But Malik had already noticed. He came again the following week, and the week after that. Not pushy, not familiar, just present. At first, villagers assumed he was interested in the registration work. Then they assumed something else. A girl Amara's age does not exchange more than 3 careful sentences with the same young man in a buying shed without tongues beginning to move. Amara ignored them. She had learned long ago that gossip starves when it finds no food. But Malik was not returning for the reason the village imagined. He was returning because something about the numbers attached to that farm refused to make sense. Men who handle records for long enough begin to hear dishonesty the way drummers hear a missed beat. Not always instantly, but eventually. Malik watched the sacks coming from Amara's farm. He watched the size of the pods in harvest weeks. He watched how much labor one girl and 2 hired boys were clearly producing. And he watched Aunt Nolly report figures too small to fit what the eye could plainly see. Not by a little, by too much. He said nothing at first. He understood villages. He understood pride. And he understood that if a person has lived too long inside a lie, you do not free them by shouting truth at them in public. So he asked smaller questions instead. One afternoon, while buyers argued over another farmer's moisture level, he stood beside Amara near the drying mats and asked, "Do you keep your own yield record?" "No." "Do you know how many sacks came from the East Grove last harvest?" "Not exactly." "Do you know how much your aunt reported for last week's sale?" "She told me." "That is not what I asked." Amara looked at him. There are moments when a person realizes a question is larger than its words. "No," she said at last. "I do not know it myself." Malik was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that split the ground beneath everything she thought she understood. "If someone lied about your farm's numbers, would you be able to prove it?" Amara almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible in the way certain impossible things do before they become personal. "She keeps the papers," Amara said. "That is not the same as keeping the truth." He did not press further. But 3 days later, as the light faded gold over the drying yard, he returned with a broken piece of chalk, a strip of old cement board, and a handful of cocoa beans. "Sit," he said. Amara frowned. "Why?" "Because if no one taught you before, someone should have." He taught her with cocoa beans first, then with charcoal marks, then with stones, groups of 5, groups of 10, tallies for sacks, simple subtraction for costs, moisture deductions, buyer rates, how to compare weight written on one line with money written on another, how a figure can pretend to be honest when placed beside words a tired person cannot read. Amara learned fast. That surprised nobody who truly knew her. A girl who remembers rainfall by month, tree rot by smell, and which path floods first in the rainy season does not lack intelligence. She lacks access. By the 4th evening, she no longer hesitated over the smaller numbers. By the 7th, she could estimate a full cartload before it touched the scale. By the 9th, she had begun to feel something she did not yet have a clean name for. Not confidence, not exactly. Anger, perhaps, or the first clear shape of it. One evening, Malik asked, "Why are you pressing so hard?" She realized she had snapped a piece of chalk in 2. "Because this took less than 2 weeks to teach," she said. "And I have given 7 years to work I was never allowed to measure." Malik did not soften the truth for her. He did not say her aunt surely meant well. He did not feed her one of those gentle lies villagers offer to keep a hard reality from becoming inconvenient. He only nodded and said, "Then learn it so well nobody can hide behind it again." So she did. She counted every sack loaded from the farm. She counted every drying tray. She counted every buyer visit. And for the first time in her life, the farm began speaking back to her, in numbers she could understand without anyone's permission. The first week she checked Aunt Nolly's account, the declared total was short by the value of 3 sacks. The second week, short by nearly 4. The third week, the pattern was too deliberate to mistake for error. Amara counted again at dawn, again at noon, again after dark with Malik's chalk marks under lamplight. The gap remained. It never once favored her. What finally broke the last piece of doubt did not happen in the buying shed. It happened at home. There was an old wooden trunk beneath Aunt Nolly's bed that Amara had been warned away from since childhood. She had never touched it. Not from obedience, from habit. Some boundaries become invisible fences because no one around you ever acts as if they can be crossed. Then, one afternoon, Aunt Nolly left in a hurry after hearing that a village elder had collapsed near the road. The house stood empty. A dry wind moved dust under the back door, and Amara, with 3 weeks of counted theft burning in her chest, went to the trunk. It was locked. She almost stepped away. Then she noticed something absurdly small. The key was not hidden at all. It hung behind the prayer cloth by the doorway, as though no one in that house had ever been expected to question what was theirs. Inside the trunk were wrappers, receipts, seed invoices, a torn photograph of her father, and beneath them all, wrapped in faded blue cloth, a wooden stamp carved with a symbol she recognized immediately. It was her father's farm seal. He used to press it into wax and ink every time he marked a sale receipt or land paper. Beneath the seal lay folded copies of delivery notes. Not 2, not 10, dozens. Amara spread them on the floor with shaking hands. She could not read every word yet, but she knew enough now. Dates, sack counts, buyer signatures, rates. Most of them were made out not to Aunt Nolly personally, but to caretaker on behalf of minor heir. Minor heir. Amara stared at the phrase until the room seemed to tilt. There were also papers bearing another name, Kobina Badu, a broker from the district road. Several notes showed separate off-book sales never mentioned in the house. Beans taken from the farm in smaller batches. Cash received privately. No record given to her. No explanation ever spoken. She sat there on the floor a long time. Then she found the document that changed everything. It was old, folded thin at the seams, witnessed by 2 elders, 1 catechist, and a clerk now long retired. It did not say the farm was Aunt Nolly's. It said the land and all future produce belonged to Amara Kojo, lawful child of the late owner, held in family care until she reached adulthood. Adulthood. Not marriage, not permanent management, not surrender. Adulthood. And Amara had turned 18 2 years earlier. For 2 full harvest seasons, the farm had been stolen from her openly, under the cover of a lie she had never known enough to challenge. Aunt Nolly returned before sunset. She found the papers spread across the floor. For 1 second, only one, her face lost control of itself. That was all Amara needed. "You told me the land was yours to manage until I married," Amara said. Aunt Nolly recovered quickly. "It is under my care." "That is not what this says." "You have been learning things beyond your station." "It says I came of age 2 years ago." Aunt Nolly shut the door behind her. Some truths do not enter a room alone. They drag fear in after them. "You opened what was not yours." Amara looked down at the seal in her palm. "My father's mark is in my hand." "That mark kept this family alive." "No," Amara said quietly. "My work kept this family alive." Aunt Nolly's voice turned cold. A girl without papers, schooling, or a husband should be careful about the kind of courage she borrows from strangers. There it was. Not denial, threat. Amara held up one of the delivery notes. Who is Kobina Badu? A broker. Why are there sales here you never named? Because not every truth belongs to a child. I am not a child. In this house, Aunt Nolly said, stepping closer, you are whatever keeps the roof standing. Silence opened between them. Then Aunt Nolly spoke the sentence Amara would remember years later more clearly than any insult shouted in public. You should thank me, she said. Without me, that farm would have been swallowed by men the month your father died. I carried what you could not. If I took from it, I took what I earned. Amara answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. If you had told me the truth, I would have carried it with you. Aunt Nolly looked at her, as if the answer itself were childish. That is why girls are not told everything, she said. You mistake willingness for power. The district registration team was due in Awere the following market day. Suddenly, the whole village cared about documents. People scrubbed old boundaries into visibility. Men who had mocked paperwork began searching for receipts. Arguments rose over inheritance, witnesses, and forgotten signatures. By noon, word had spread that every producing farm would be provisionally matched to an owner of record before the planting subsidies were approved for next season. Ownership mattered now, in a way even the stubborn could not pretend was decorative. That same night, Amara learned Aunt Nolly had made her move. Kobina Badu had arrived at the house after dark. He did not come through the front path. He came by the cassava side, where difficult business preferred to travel. From outside the window, Amara heard enough. If the farm passed into formal dispute, Badu's off-book arrangement would be exposed. If registration went through with Amara's documents, money owed would become visible. So a plan was quickly made. Aunt Nolly would present herself as sole managing owner, claim the heir had declined responsibility, and push the papers through before Amara could find the courage to speak. Courage. People often talk about courage as if it arrives whole. It does not. Sometimes it comes in pieces. A lesson at dusk, a number checked twice, a sentence read alone, a seal held in the hand long enough to stop feeling impossible. By dawn, Amara knew what she would do. She went not to Malik first, but to Elder Kweku, one of the two witnesses whose name appeared on her father's paper. He was old now, slow to rise, slower to trust excitement. But when Amara placed the document in front of him and asked, very simply, "Did you sign this for my father?" the old man put on his cracked glasses and went quiet. After a long time, he said, "Yes. And whose land was it meant to protect?" "Yours." He closed the paper carefully and looked at her in a way he never had before. "Has nobody ever read this to you?" Amara said nothing. He did not ask again. Instead, he rose, sent for his walking stick, and said, "Then let us go where this should have been said years ago." The registration table was set beneath the buying shed. Malik sat with two district clerks, a stack of forms, boundary maps, and a tin box of seals. Farmers queued with impatience and fear in equal measure. Aunt Nolly stepped forward confidently when their farm was called. "I am Nali Kojo," she announced, "caretaker and acting owner of the late Kojo Mensa plot." Malik looked up, but his face revealed nothing. "Supporting documents?" he asked. She handed them over. He checked the papers slowly. Then Elder Kweku's walking stick struck the ground behind her. Once. Twice. A sound the village recognized. Amara stepped into the open. People turned. Some because they loved drama, some because they sensed that shame was about to change direction. Elder Kweku spoke first. "The girl has a document that should be heard before any registration continues." Aunt Nali spun around. "This is a family matter." "Land stops being only a family matter," said Malik calmly, "the moment ownership is formally recorded." Amara's mouth was dry. Her heart beat so hard she felt it in her wrists. For a brief moment, she wanted to disappear. Not leave, disappear. There is a difference. To leave is to act. To disappear is to wish reality would spare you the act entirely. But then she felt the carved ridges of her father's seal inside her wrapper cloth, and she stepped forward. Malik gestured to the registration table. "Present what you have." Amara laid down the old document, then the sealed sale notes, then the delivery copies, then the wooden stamp. A murmur moved through the shed. Kobina Badu, standing near the rear post, went still in the way guilty men do when they realize events have outrun the version they prepared for. Malik unfolded the inheritance paper and read it aloud, not quickly, not dramatically, just clearly. "Lawful child, held in care until adulthood, transfer of authority upon maturity, witnessed and marked. No permanent ownership granted to caretaker." When he finished, the shed had gone so quiet that even flies sounded loud. Aunt Nali found her voice first. "I managed that farm when she was a child." "No one disputes that," Malik said. "I paid debts on that land." "Perhaps," he said, "but management is not ownership." Then he turned to Amara. "Can you read the delivery numbers on these notes yourself?" A week earlier, that question would have destroyed her. Now, it steadied her. Amara picked up the first paper. Her voice trembled on the date. "Less on the sack count." Not at all by the time she read the payment line. Then she read another, and another. Separate deliveries, private sales, hidden figures, amounts never spoken at home. She read enough for every person under that roof to understand the shape of the deception. The buyer's clerk checked one set against archived carbon copies. The numbers matched. Aunt Nali's house accounts did not. "What debt?" Malik asked at last. Aunt Nali lifted her chin. "My brother died owing money." "To whom?" She did not answer immediately. That told everyone where to look. All eyes turned to Kobina Badu. He tried to smile. "Informal village obligations are often misunderstood." "Then let us understand them properly," Malik said. "District procedures are slow until dishonesty threatens to embarrass the people administering them. Then they become astonishingly efficient." Badu's side papers were requested. He resisted. The senior clerk insisted. The figures came out badly for him. Interest added twice, carrying charges invented, brokerage deductions never agreed, seasonal losses assigned only when it benefited his side of the account. He had not merely profited from confusion, he had fed it. And Aunt Nali, unable or unwilling to measure what he told her, had passed that theft downward onto the one person with the least power to resist. When the clerks finished checking, Malik spoke in the steady voice of a man who has seen this story before in different clothes. "So the brother died," he said. "The sister feared losing everything. The broker saw advantage, and the child worked a farm whose own papers were kept from her until she was old enough to have been free of this 2 harvests ago. Nobody corrected him, because nobody could." Amara did not cry. People later remembered that, not because tears would have weakened her, but because there is a kind of hurt that burns clean once truth enters it. She looked at Aunt Nali and said, "You could have told me." For the first time, her aunt seemed smaller than the authority she had worn for years. "I was trying to hold the house together," she said. "With my hands," Amara replied, "and without my knowledge." The district team did not resolve everything that day. Villages rarely change in one speech. But ownership was recorded. That mattered most. The farm was entered under Amara Kojo, lawful heir and producing owner. A provisional dispute notice was attached to all prior off-book claims. Kobina Badu's transactions were referred upward for review, and until that review finished, he was barred from purchasing from registered farms in Awere without a witness countersigning each deal. As for Aunt Nali, Elder Kweku requested that the matter not be buried inside paperwork alone. So before the crowd dispersed, he asked Amara one final question. "What do you want done?" That is the sort of question villages almost never ask the person most wronged. Amara stood in the shed where she had been humiliated days earlier and thought carefully before answering. "I do not want her thrown out," she said at last. "Old pain does not become justice just because it changes direction." The crowd shifted. Even Aunt Nali looked up. "But I want this recorded," Amara continued. "The land is mine. The farm accounts will be mine. And from this season onward, no sack leaves that soil without two things beside it: my count and my mark." She placed her father's seal on the table. "Also," she said, turning so everyone could hear, "every girl working family land in this village should know how to read the numbers attached to it." No one laughed, not after what they had just seen. So Elder Kweku, who still understood the power of saying a thing while witnesses are present, struck his stick once more and declared that the buying shed would host a free counting and record-reading hour every market eve for any child or worker who wished to learn. Not charity, correction. That is a different thing. The next harvest season was not easier. Truth does not turn work into comfort. The pods still had to be cut. The beans still had to be fermented. Rain still spoiled what it pleased when mats were pulled in too late. But from that season forward, the farm's numbers no longer traveled only through somebody else's mouth before reaching Amara's life. She kept her own ledger. She weighed her own sacks. She learned every line of every receipt, until buyers stopped testing how far confusion could be stretched in front of her. Malik stayed, not like a miracle dropped from the sky, and not like a prince from stories told to children who are meant to wait for rescue. He stayed like a good man stays, consistently, respectfully, without demanding that being useful to her somehow entitled him to own any part of her future. He helped her file the remaining disputes. He showed her how to copy every document twice. He taught her where signatures matter most and where stamps can lie if no one reads what sits above them. In time, the village stopped speaking of Amara as the girl who had been sheltered by her aunt. They began speaking of her as the woman who had taken back a farm with a paper, a count, and a voice nobody could interrupt once it found its full strength. And Aunt Nali? She lived long enough to witness a change she had once considered dangerous. Girls came to the shed with chalk on their fingers. Boys came too. Children of farmers, children of laborers, nieces, sons, orphans. Quiet girls who had spent years being called helpful when what they really were was invisible. They learned to count sacks, read rates, compare totals, mark their own names. And because of that, a certain kind of theft found Awere less welcoming than before. These days, if you pass through that village in harvest season, you may still see an old wooden seal wrapped in cloth at the bottom of Amara's record box. People say she keeps it there not because she needs its authority, but because she remembers the day authority finally returned to the hand it was meant for. And when younger women ask her what changed everything, she never says luck. She never says rescue. She never even says courage first. She says this: "The day I learned to read what my labor was worth was the day silence stopped being useful to the people using it against me." That is why the elders in Awere tell their daughters something their mothers were not always told in time. If a person works the land, they must know the count. If a person carries the load, they must know the price. If a name appears on a paper, the owner of that name must be able to read it with their own eyes. Because a lie grows strongest wherever truth must first ask permission to be verified. And because the easiest person to rob is not always the weakest one. Sometimes it is simply the one nobody bothered to teach. If this story moved you, write "seal" in the comments. And if you believe every hard-working woman deserves to know exactly what her hands...
Press the subscribe button for many new untold African folktales, only on Untold African.